Hey, you guys remember that god-awful Game of Thrones real-time strategy game that we covered a couple weeks back that suddenly disappeared and then reappeared in your feed? Yeah, those guys still owe me money at the time of recording this. Set that aside a moment, because that's not the only Game of Thrones video game out there, or even the only Game of Thrones video game by the developer Cyanide Studios. We'll get to the other Game of Thrones game next week, so hold your horses, because I'm sure that someone is going to remember that. In the meantime, as I mentioned in the last videos, Cyanide Studios also announced that they were working on an RPG in addition to the RTS game that they made. Game of Thrones, same name as the show, and this time it is based around the show, came out the next year in mid-2012 to some pretty bad reviews citing poor graphics and sloppy voice actings, but looking back now, it's certainly not a bad game, and dare I even say probably the best game associated with Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. What really helps this game's case this time around is that George R.R. Martin and the people behind the official fan site, who would eventually go on to write the world of Ice and Fire, helped out with the writing of the game's story, and it shows. This is something I'd personally consider on par with like one of the older BioWare style RPGs, like, you know, the good ones. This game does a good job at respecting the lore and not getting in the way of the main story taking place in the books and the shows. A good parallel I can think of is kind of like that one Lord of the Rings game that came out back in the day that didn't necessarily follow the main story, but was definitely taking place in the world of Lord of the Rings at the same time as the events of Lord of the Rings. That's a good approximation of what kind of story we're dealing with here. This game is a good deal better than Telltale story-wise, which is saying something because Telltale's game was almost exclusively story, and gameplay-wise, it's better than that RTS, but that one doesn't exactly have a lot going on in the gameplay department in the first place. That doesn't necessarily mean this game has no flaws whatsoever. If anything, much like its counterparts, this game is a hot mess in a whole lot of places, but if you're into Game of Thrones, this is gonna be worth your time. This game is an extremely curious case of how the heck did we not know about this, despite the clear effort made by George R.R. Martin to make sure that this one wasn't a dud like the last one. Heck, he even makes a personal appearance in this game that we're going to get to in a moment. For now, let's start with the story, as that seems to be the big focus of this game. The first thing of note about this game is that it has a massive single-player story. It's exclusively single-player, but it still bears stating because they put on the box that this was a 30-hour campaign, and they weren't kidding around. For research purposes and getting background footage, it took me 25 hours to get through this. And I play my games pretty briskly if I'm just going in to get footage. Like, I don't stop and smell the roses as much as I'd like. There is a lot going on in this game. There are two primary plot threads that link up mid-game, which lead to a big finale. The first protagonist is Sir Mors Westford, a ranger of the Night's Watch that took the Black shortly after the end of Robert's Rebellion for reasons he would prefer to keep to himself. His big thing is that he's a skin changer with his doggy, and that doggy is very good at tracking down and killing people. Also, he's absolutely yoked! Mors' task was tracking down and protecting some girl on behalf of the current Hand of the King, Jon Arryn. Commander Mormont allows for this by naming him a recruiter of the Night's Watch, which allows him to basically go do whatever he wants wherever he wants to do it. In true Song of Ice and Fire fashion, the story is told through multiple points of view, with the second major point of view being Sir Alistair Sarwyck. Alistair is a Red Priest of R'hllor who recently returned from a self-imposed 15-year exile to his lordly home after hearing news that his father had passed away and that his younger brother, Gawain, has disappeared and is suspected of patricide. Just to make things all the better, Alistair learns that his illegitimate half-brother Valar has earned the favor of Queen Cersei and is being allowed to marry Alistair's sister Illyana in order to become the sort of legitimate lord of their land, Riverspring. From the outset, the main connecting thread between both the protagonists is that they were originally from the Westerlands and served under Lord Tywin Lannister during Robert's Rebellion, and something caused them to leave and never turn back at the end of the rebellion, until now. And this is just the main premise for the story. Like, for a largely unknown game that seems pretty low budget, holy crap, there is a lot of writing and storytelling in every nook and cranny of this game, and it really shows that George R.R. Martin did lend a hand in the creation of this story. This feels like it could have been some sort of side plot or like a little novella that GRRM put out because he just didn't feel like finishing Winds of Winter yet. Where this game's story doesn't do so well, though, is the voice acting that will tell you the story. While Cyanide was able to get some of the original actors, like the ones for Very and Sir Jorah Mormont, to reprise their roles, which might have also been a contractual thing, because some actors do that, where if they're going to portray a character, they are the only person allowed to portray that character in any medium. This game suffers from a lack of voice actor variety, despite it having a ton of spoken lines over the course of this game. I have to admit that at first this is really jarring, kind of like in Oblivion or other games with a lot of dialogue or a small handful of voice actors, but you eventually get used to it after a while and you won't notice it because you just assume, oh yeah, the guy that plays Morse kind of sounds like NPCs, whatever. But as soon as you get to any game that has better voice acting or even passable voice acting and you go back to this game, it becomes super noticeable and jarring all over again. This game has a lot of dialogue, and in that a lot of dialogue choices. Unsurprisingly, this means that it suffers from BioWare conversation syndrome, where lots of the options will say one thing, but ultimately end up meaning something almost entirely different than what you thought it was going to mean. This is inescapable in a game like this because there's a lot to be said after each dialogue option. And this definitely isn't the worst I've ever seen it, because the options are more like general feels of how the conversation will go, because you don't just say your initial line, you have a whole conversation based on that line, which I kind of like that, like over, say, a game like Fallout where you choose each individual line, because this lets you just sit back and enjoy the story unfolding in front of you, and you don't have to fawn over each dialogue choice. You just sort of like decide how you're going to handle this conversation, and then you're good. There's also a lot of player choice in this game, stemming from the dialogue options, but they're not necessarily exclusively in the speech checks. Often your ability to influence what happens in the immediate future or the long game is determined by which side quests you choose to carry out and how you choose to decide people's fate at the end of quests. The best example I can think of is towards the middle of the game, you know something is about to go down in the castle you're currently staying at, and you're very likely going to have to fight your way out of this place. Now, instead of trying to talk your way through things, you're given the option to maybe try and weaken the best of this castle's knights by simply going to the training yard and beating the love of the seven out of them. It's tough. You'll likely have to blow a lot of cash to spam bottles of wildfire to throw at them to get their HP down, because they are bonkers strong. But when you do fight your way out of the castle later on, these knights are barely able to stand and you just breeze right through them, rather than having a really hard fight towards the end of this chapter. And there's one more thing I want to talk about in this story before we move on, that I'm just gonna let the scene speak for itself.
Thinking of you. You see, Maester Martin has graced his sweeping history of the Seven Kingdoms with several new pages.
What lies! I wrote an entire chapter this week.
I stand corrected. I have not been fair to your tireless quill. Please forgive me. So when can we hope to see your completed masterpiece?
I already told you. Next year.
He says that every year.
This automatically makes the 15 hours it took to get to this point worth it, and this game is now a 10 out of 10 in my eyes. Game of Thrones is a traditionally styled Western RPG. You start the game choosing a class, which will determine what weapons and armor you're more suited to, and then you'll get to distribute your stat and ability points accordingly. Me being an idiot and thinking that there would be grinding, I dumped all my points into intelligence for the first character I got, Moors, when I saw that a higher intelligence meant more skill points every level. I ended up getting my butt kicked in nearly every fight I had up until I leveled a bit and evened out my stats, but lucky for me, the game maybe thinks you might have done this, because you'll get a lot of stat bonuses just for surviving certain story events. What I really like about this character creation system is the traits system. I haven't ever seen this before in a game, but when you're picking your traits, kind of like your stuff that gives you a benefit and a setback, your benefits are just straight up and up benefits, like things that you're just genuinely better at. However, in order to pick any of the benefits, you also need to have an according number of setbacks, of disabilities, to balance out your abilities. Say if one ability that you want is going to cost you 3 talent points, you have to go into the negative traits and get at least 3 points worth of negative character traits, which makes for a very interesting character balancing system. I really like that, and I kind of wish that I'd see it in more games. Aside from the good old-fashioned main combat, where basically you press a button to slow things down, kind of Mass Effect like, and then you choose what abilities you want to do in a queue, you also have each character's special abilities. Moors, being a skin changer, can take control of his doggy in a sort of stealth segment where you sneak around as a dog, taking out guards that are by themselves and even following the scents of quest objectives, and sometimes even finding secret items by smell. Unfortunately for Alistair, his special ability does not involve ripping throats out of guards. However, he is allowed to call upon R'hllor to give him sight beyond sight, which allows him to find hidden items, secret passages, and the like. He also has this thing for the middle of combat where he can light his sword on fire, a la Thoros of Mir, and it will do fire damage on top of base damage. And then on top of that, you also have the ability to, while you're in combat, call upon the Red God to give you fire magic, such as making enemies that are already on fire explode, or say resurrecting your buddies, fun stuff like that. Morse gets this too with his skin changer abilities, where he can have his dog attack enemies and either disarm their weapons, remove their shield, or just remove their throat from their neck. Your choice. In spite of all the variety in this combat though, it's an absolute slog to get through, and it kind of feels like the overcooked veggies you gotta power through in order to get to the dessert that is the character interaction in the story. I know exactly how I would fix this game's combat too. Replace this slow-mo, pseudo-Mass Effect crap with something more akin to the Arkham Asylum way of doing things, where you're in a free-flowing combat where you just, instead of activating skills, do combos. That would make this game's combat so much better. But part of me gets the feeling that maybe the developers didn't have the time or the required expertise to make a system like that. Like maybe they just didn't know how to do a thing like that, or couldn't contract someone out to do it for them. But it's wishful thinking. I'd rather have something like Arkham City than this mess. This combat is the most tedious thing and often was the main thing causing me to stop and take a break from the game, just because if you wipe, the autosaves are few and far between, so unless you're constantly save scumming, you're gonna do a lot of backtracking in this game. The gameplay is easily the weakest part of this experience. It's a shame too, because this game has the trappings of a niche classic, but it's being held back by a combat system that was dated even at the time of this game's creation. Lucky for us, there's a lot of non-combat side quests and other things that at least kind of make up for how bad the fighting in this game is. Now let's talk about the thing that's been right in front of you this whole time, and you've probably noticed it. Even for the time, this game is ugly as sin. These graphics aren't just dated either. I'm gonna put some games that came out around the same time as this game did in the screen right now, and you can just see how, even for the time, this thing looked awful. And this game uses a lot of bad texturing, a lot of poorly modeled characters, items clipping through other items, and it's generally too dark to see anything unless you want to turn your gamma way up. You'll often find yourself in what was supposed to be a camera shot from another character's point of view in a dialogue scene, but instead you're faced with the inside of the character's head texture because someone couldn't figure out how to temporarily remove something from a cutscene for the purpose of point of view. And they could only get so creative with that camera positioning. This game was released in the middle of 2012, which was towards the end of the current console generation of the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. However, it looks like it might have been very late in the PlayStation 2's graphical powerhouse, or maybe very early in the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It just doesn't look good. Bad textures, wonky modeling, stuff clips into other stuff, and just all around you'll find yourself thinking, okay, this game is ugly and hard to look at. There's also another ugly matter, which is at times this game just feels too long. Like, despite the story being really interesting, and you're gonna find yourself mashing the skip dialogue button and speed reading through the subtitles because this game at times just goes on and on. It's impressive at times, really, but at the same time, thanks to the quality of the combat and the art assets, along with the voice acting of this game, it really starts to grate on you after a while, and I could only take this game in small doses. It was a bit of a challenge to get to the ending of this game, or endings, I should say. By the way, this game has 4 different endings that you can work your way to, but it's not like a Mass Effect 3 type deal. You actually have to make a bunch of non-dialogue choices over the course of the game to lead you to your ending. There's also the matter of the DLCs that this game has, which is ugly at first, but then when I really got some time with the DLCs, I was okay with it. The first one is a story DLC, simple enough, adds even more playtime to this game. The second one is a skin pack for your doggy in case you want a Doberman or a Mastiff instead of a pit bull type dog. And the third is a weapon pack where you get a bunch of really powerful weapons from the very start of the game. Normally I'd be entirely against such a thing, except that in this case, the game's weapons that it presents to you are far too expensive for you to purchase at the start of the game instead of just given to you freely. And then when you are able to purchase them, they will be pretty good for a while, like say if you save up your money. But these weapons are clearly not the best weapons in the game, so I guess that makes it fair. The weapons you get from this DLC are a fan service type thing. You can spend your gold on stuff like Robert Baratheon's Warhammer, the Lion's Tooth, etc. It's a nice little nod that some of these weapons are here, but they were also spoilery. At the time that this game came out, we were only in season 2 of the Game of Thrones television show, but there were references to things like the fight between the Mountain and the Viper, the Red Wedding, and so on. So for the book readers, I was like, oh, nice Easter egg, but for the show watchers, they had no idea that they just had something subconsciously planted into their... Jesus Christ, cat! Get off the desk! Get off the desk! You do not jump from on top of the desk, especially when Daddy is recording. I love you, saucy boy, but we can't be doing that. You almost took out my microphone. You could have hurt yourself. Your mother and I are going to have a talk about your actions when she gets home. Okay, where were we? Oh yeah, there's one last thing I forgot to bring up that's a weird tick about this game, in that it was sort of flaunted as a killer app for Steam's big picture mode. Like, you know, in case instead of wanting the convenience of a mouse's precision and the ability to right click on things for more options, you wanted a clunky, boring console-like experience that takes you 3 times to get through any menu than you normally would. Yeah, we will do that for you on your PC. Pretend you're using an inferior device. But yeah, for some reason this game only works on PC if you're running Steam Big Picture mode. I don't know why, I don't know how to fix it, I just know that that's sort of how it is. If I had to sum this game up in one simple phrase, it'd be that this game is an oddity. And not only in how it received direct story writing input from George R.R. Martin and the duo behind The World of Ice and Fire, but in how it's so lopsided in the quality of its assets and how no one really talked about this game. I remember being a big book reader and a very avid show watcher at the time that this game came out, but I never heard anything about this. And here I am, what, 7-8 years later, about reviewing this game, and it's just surreal. Part of me wants to think that after the disaster that was the first Game of Thrones game that Cyanide Studios made, the second one got mothballed in the advertising department as the showrunners were worried about the game's publicity and how it might have a negative effect on the budding brand that was HBO's Game of Thrones. It's a shame too, because in spite of this game's many blemishes, the story is still enough to make it a worthy contender to be involved in the mania of all things that is Game of Thrones, and if anything, so far it's doing better than the final season is right now. It's pretty impressive that this game got out by the same people that made a Game of Thrones Genesis, not even a year after that flaming piece of trash was tossed into the dumpster, setting the whole affair on fire. I have a feeling that George R.R. Martin took more interest in this game and was willing to help out and even lend his own image to this game, which is a sight more involvement than he had with the real-time strategy game, and maybe Cyanide got a bit more support from the show for that? I don't know, that kind of contradicts my other theory. This game was announced at the same time as the RTS was, so maybe that extra time was what it needed to be a better game. Like, not a great smash hit game, but a better game than the real-time strategy. I would personally recommend this game if you're into Game of Thrones, long story-driven RPGs, extremely self-aware jokes, or if you're one of those obsessive adherents to the $1 1 hour rule. Because right now this game is like $1 2 hours if you're going at a leisurely pace, and that's not even counting the story DLC. This game and all the associated DLCs are $15 right now on Steam, and it might be a nice palate cleanser depending on how well this weekend's episode of Game of Thrones ends up being. I'll link the Steam page in the description and you can check it out if you wanna. That's all I have for today. I have no idea how this video got as long as it was without a cooking segment, but I guess I had a lot to say about this game. If you like this video or what I'm doing here, your best option is to subscribe and stay tuned for the inevitable train wreck that will be the Game of Thrones Telltale game. If you want to help me make videos of an even higher caliber, let me please direct you to my Patreon, where you can do just that by funding this channel. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to my $10 patrons, Trey, Jonathan Cadron, The Otterman, Che Patterson, and McFluffers. Your support is extra supporty, and I very much appreciate you for that. Now, sign-offs are stupid, and I have no idea how to do them. Bye. Oh, saucy boy. Saucy boy. Saucy boy, it happened. Oh, wow, you can... Oh, is that my... No, you can't see what I look like in this. The mystery continues. And also, my room is trashed right now. Saucy boy, we hit 30,000. Saucy boy. Yes, I did have hot links and eggs for dinner. I was feeling breakfast for dinner, but we made 30,000. Come on, you gotta have some reaction to that. What about a reaction to a scritch? I'm not sure if you're liking this or hating this. Chin scritch. Celebratory scritches. Look at that pleased face. Only like 70,000 more to go.